How does reconnecting with the soul make a difference in our work or in the world? Why is this work important to anyone besides the person who does it?
Every great movement for social change has been animated by people who did serious inner work to sort of constellate, consolidate, and give trajectory to the powers of the human heart, because those were the only powers they had. Everything else had been taken away from them, all external forms of power. And so only by taking the inner life seriously and learning how to access and aim the power that's in us, not only individually but collectively, could any of these great movements for change have happened. The Black liberation movement in this country, the liberation movement in South Africa to get out from under apartheid, in Eastern Europe to get out from under communism, in Latin America to get out from under raw exploitation of many sorts. And those are, of course, ongoing movements. But if you ask yourself, what makes a Rosa Parks? Or what makes a Václav Havel? Or what makes a Nelson Mandela, who spent 38 years in prison? What makes these people is their capacity to take the inner life seriously and to tap the sources of power that lie within us, that are as important in the transformation of institutions and societies as any of the external powers that we give so much credit to. So our theory of change certainly begins with that work of individual transformation, which we don't force on people. People have to choose that. People have to enter a free and safe space to let that emerge within themselves. That's what our Circle of Trust is all about. But the Circle of Trust is also about a community of folks who both evoke that inner work from each other and then support and affirm each other, bless each other really, in carrying that inner work forward. Because every one of those people I have named, the Rosa Parkses, the Václav Havels, the Nelson Mandelas, needed not only inner work, but external community to help them hold the fruits of that work and face into the challenges of being true to the inner teacher. That's not an easy thing to do, and one needs a community of support in order to do it. So we believe, I believe, that the work we help people do inwardly has consequences in the larger world. I think what we're doing in Circles of Trust for us ordinary mortals, which those three people are too, ordinary mortals, I think we're helping each other reclaim selfhood, identity and integrity, the power of our own hearts, in a way that's held with discipline and intentionality that can flow towards the transformation of institutions and larger social systems. I think it's pretty obvious to a lot of people that we live in very broken times. We live in times with lots and lots of gaps between the difficult realities of life and what we know to be possible humanly. We know that we live in a world at war. We also know that it is possible to live at peace. That's a big example. We know that we live in a situation where health care is not available to probably the people who need it most. And we know that humanly it would be possible to make it available. So on and on and on it goes. Everybody would have their own example of what I've come to call these tragic gaps. And I've come to believe that one of the most important qualities that a person can have in our time, a person who wants to take leadership, whether that's positional leadership or non-positional leadership, people who want simply to help make this a better world, one of the most important capacities they can have is the capacity to stand in the tragic gap, however that may be defined in their lives. And to stand there without flipping out on either side. To flip out on the side of too much reality is to become cynical. It's a jungle out there and I'll find some way to fight and survive. That cynicism that simply contributes to making the world a harder place. You flip out on the other side into too much possibility, and you become, I think, a kind of irrelevant idealist who simply flies above the battle without ever really descending to engage it in human terms.
It is not easy to live in this middle ground, in the space between what is and what could be. In fact, it is uncomfortable and scary. So we need communities of support where we can develop the inner strength necessary to hold both the world's reality and our hopes for the future.
So the capacity to stand in this tragic gap and to hold those tensions is to me one of the great human qualities that I think we help cultivate in circles of trust by giving people more access to that inner ground where you can stand and hold what appear to be radical opposites in a way that helps you become a co-creative agent of finding a new way through, a new way ahead. Not that the tragic gap will ever disappear. I mean, I don't believe that perfection is going to happen in my lifetime anyway. But that the quality of holding that tension is a quality that helps move us forward individually and collectively into something that's a little better, a little better, a little better, inviting those better angels of our nature onto the scene.
Standing in the tragic gap can be a heartbreaking experience. But instead of breaking into pieces, the heart can be broken open into larger capacity, new possibilities, and more life-giving responses to the struggles of our times.
And the whole question of how to allow that tight, clenched fist of a muscle called the heart to allow it to open into a larger, more capacious vessel, I think that's one that we work on constantly in our circles of trust. So I think the opening of the heart in ways that allow us to stand in this tragic gap is one of the most important contributions that this kind of work can make to a suffering world.
One of the gifts we are given in a circle of trust is a chance to see how abnormal violence is. Here, surrounded by ground rules that help us relate to others in life-giving ways, we experience our innate capacity to honor, not violate, the identity and integrity of every human being, including ourselves. As we create a safe space for each other's soul, we discover what it means to live nonviolently, and we develop a vision of how we might live that way in daily life.
It's not just in relation to war in the world, as important as it is that we take a nonviolent position towards problem solving on a global scale, I believe, but that the workplace, which is the battlefield of many people's lives in the sense that it's where they feel their identity and integrity threatened so often, as that doctor does who said to me a few months ago, I work in a situation where every day they have me right on the edge of violating my Hippocratic oath. Well, that's violence. That's institutional violence. That we understand that violence isn't something we do only with bombs and bullets or with punches and kicks, but we do it institutionally, we do it verbally, we do it in our relationships to each other. By what? By violating the integrity of the other person's soul. How do you keep from violating the integrity of another person's soul? I think you start by learning to honor the integrity of your own. You cannot give to another person what you don't give to yourself. It's just impossible.
Nonviolence means a commitment to act in every situation in ways that honor the soul. In circles of trust, we begin to see how the principles and practices of the circle can be exported to other parts of our worlds, to the family, the neighborhood, the workplace, and the public arena.
Very concretely, with some of our teachers, for example, they report that having learned in circles of trust a nonviolent way of receiving ideas that they disagree with, where normally they would have run at that idea or at the person holding that idea with their own opinion and created a head-on collision, which is our normal model of how we're supposed to engage in change, they learn instead to be receptive, to be open, to turn to wonder about where this comes from in this person's life, and then to ask an honest, open question, which not only helps hear that other into deeper speech, but sometimes will help me, the questioner, hear that there's more that we have in common than I thought at first blush. It takes time, it's slow, it doesn't happen overnight, but if you're persistent, some mutual understanding starting to build, which I think represents very concretely nonviolence in the workplace and creates both a more peaceable and a more fruitful outcome for people in working situations when they learn how to honor the soul of the other, which is what I mean by nonviolence. And so we think a lot these days about circles of trust as something of a model of the kind of community that needs to be out there for citizens to recover their capacity to approach our common life in this country with decency, with openness, with generosity, and with a lack of fear, which again is the root problem courage to teach, courage to lead, courage to serve, is trying to address the fear that so often paralyzes us and shuts us down. And of course, in our society these days, nationally and globally, the fear in a very sharp and paralyzing way is a fear of the other, whoever that may be, the person of another color, the person of another religion, the person of another ethnicity. If we are going to recover the citizenly habits that make a democracy work, we need to have this country dotted through our churches and synagogues and mosques, through our schools, even in our workplaces, all kinds of institutional settings. We need to have this country dotted with circles of people who are learning to talk to one another in a creative way about common problems on which they have quite different opinions. I remember some years ago visiting a place in Tennessee called the Highlander Folk Center. I think it's now called the Highlander Research Center. And the Highlander Research Center, when I visited it, was essentially a farmhouse with some other buildings out in the middle of the Tennessee countryside. And in the living room, the big old living room of this big old farmhouse, there were about 20 Tennessee rocking chairs in a circle. And I was powerfully reminded that it was in that circle, at that place, that people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer and lots of others whose names we don't know that well, gathered together in the 50s, whites and blacks in the same circle, together across racial lines for the first time in that era of Southern life, talking about what it was like to be a black person and to be a white person in a highly segregated society, and the price that everybody was paying for that. And that out of telling those stories and out of the mutual understanding that emerged, and then out of some very specific training in nonviolence, which made those circles different from circles of trust as we hold them. But out of that sitting in circle, telling stories, sharing of lives, touching the soul, rejoining it with the citizenly role, came a civil rights movement, which was one of the great acts of citizenship of the 20th century. A history like that, and the fact that so much has happened out of these small circles of people, learning to tell each other the truth in a generous and hospitable way, neither giving nor taking offense. A story like that reminds me of the power of circles of trust to restore the soul of the citizen, and in turn to help restore the soul of democracy.